Hi, everybody, and welcome. This is part two of week one, where I get to, I've already talked to you about the course at a glance. Now we want to talk about what's really in week one in terms of content. I want to apologize in case there's any background noise. I'm outside, and unfortunately, I may compete from time to time with my border collie, or less likely, but possible, are two dachshunds that are still puppies. And on cue, one of them gives me a woof. So that's my disclaimer for you for this presentation. But I think you're going to like the information that I've put together for you. And this is critical to understanding how to successfully complete the week one project. I'm not going to tell you do A, B, C. I want to give you the background information. I want to give you the knowledge, the theory as to what we're doing and why. And I think when I do that, you're going to be able to create a great week one assignment. So let's dig into this a little bit. First, I think it's important to understand the function of public relations. And public relations is a boundary organization. Now, let me come back for a moment and say, why did I say function? Well, because I've got an organizational model that you're looking at right now. And you may be saying, hey, wait a minute. I'm a 3-person shop, or I'm a 1-person shop. Regardless, you still perform a public relations function. And that function is the same, even though you may be the entire public relations supply chain, from coming up with the strategy to implementing the strategy. It's still all the same. So it's important to understand the model of the function of public relations. So what you see is in the inner circle, denoted by the red, you have the C-suite, the executive suite. It's where the owner, the chief executive officer, the president, chief marketing officer, chief information officer, that's where they reside. And at the C-suite is where organizational strategy is developed. So, for example, the chief marketing officer, they, in conjunction with the other members of the C-suite, they're going to decide what the organizational marketing strategy should be for the organization. And remembering back to new media, we talked about basically there's 4 general strategies that could be followed, which is a simplified funnel. We have awareness, we have lead generation, we have conversion, and we have advocacy. So that's where all that comes from, is inside the C-suite. Now, as they develop these strategies, and by the way, let me break strategy down a little bit further for you as well. Strategy, in its basic form, is the business strategy, which encompasses the mission, the vision, the culture, the values, and any key projects that are designed to move the company from point A to point B. Now, these projects usually have some telltale attributes, such as they're very expensive, meaning that they're taking capital or money resources away from other projects in order to advance the end goal of the company. I like to call those projects critical success factors. Why? Because if we don't implement those critical success factors, we will not be successful in moving the company from point A to point B. Give me a second, please. So that's why business strategy is so important. But we can break business strategy down further as well. We can take a look at the organizational component of that business strategy. And when I say organizational strategy, what I'm talking about is, how does work get done? That can be everything from the design, the organizational design. A lot of times you'll see that represented as the boxology. You know, here's where the president is, here's each of the divisions, and then here are the people that work in those divisions. It's really not about making a pretty picture, a pretty design. It's more about accurately reflecting how the work is done within the organization. but we also talk about the processes that are involved. So when we talk about organizational strategy, we're really thinking about the organizational design and the actual processes that have to happen. And then business strategy, again, can be broken down to another level, which is the people strategy. Who is going to do the work? I like to think of, when I think about strategy, I always think about the what is the business strategy? The how are we going to get the organization to do this work? And finally, the who. Now, if I was a great producer, I'd have a CSI theme song playing in the background. Anyway, the who then is who's actually getting the work done. I've got a tickle in my throat this morning that just won't stop. And since this is like take 5, we're going to do it anyway. Okay, so now we understand that public relations has to communicate to the rest of the organization the strategy that's developed from the C-suite, the business strategy, the organizational strategy, and the people strategy. And understand that from a marketing standpoint, the marketing strategy that's communicated is that very simplified funnel of awareness, lead generation, conversion, and advocacy. Next, we go out to the wider component of the organization, and I've broken this down into 4 basic functions within the organization. You got to produce a product or a service. You got to sell a product or service, including marketing a product or service. You got planning that goes into effect, research and development and business planning and all that. And then you also have maintenance. Maintenance is all the organizations that are usually considered staff groups. So sometimes marketing can be considered maintenance because it's not directly selling. But I like to put marketing up in distribution. So maintenance would be things like finance and human resources. You've got to be hiring people to continually fulfill the need of the organization to be able to do work. And you've got to be able to account for both your expenses and your revenue. So accounting or finance and human resources are normally the core of the maintenance part of the organization. Again, if you're a small shop, you're probably doing all this. So then what happens is the strategy, which usually inherent in the strategy that's coming from the C-suite, includes operational and tactical information. And that's what gets dealt with in the outer circle of production, distribution, maintenance, and planning. And of course, that's going to have impact into our publics, our audience of the organization. So public relations domains are both the C-suite and the boundary between the C-suite and the organization and the outside world. Let's take a look at marketing and public relations. So this is a Venn diagram, and the way a Venn diagram works is that overlaps are shown. And in particular, I'll let you read through the marketing components. I want to get to where there's an overlap between marketing and public relations. So first, we have in the realm of advertising, there's corporate branding and advertising that occurs, and that's a crossover between marketing and public relations. Then we have inbound marketing, where we have the website and social media. Again, that's a crossover. There are functions in the marketing side that need to deal in in those domains, but it's also domains that public relations has to deal with. And then we also have influencer marketing. And as you can remember from new media marketing, influencer marketing includes content marketing, it's brand journalism, it's native advertising, and it also happens to be when we have a crisis that public relations is dealing with. So we would call it digital crisis communications. And then finally, there's product publicity that again fits into both realms. So that's the crossover. And then when we deal with just what is public relations, we can see that it's corporate identity, branding, media relations, crisis communication, and philanthropic activities such as charitable donations. This is the realm of public relations. This is the realm of strategic internet public relations as it relates to not only marketing, but digital marketing as well. So I hope this diagram puts everything into context for you, provides some greater meaning and understanding as to where marketing and public relations operate and what activities are actually going on. Well, one of the things that is inherent in public relations, remember I talked about that it's a boundary function, and essentially what the boundary function does is communicate change. It communicates change to our various groups within the organization, and then change to the greater public and audiences. So I thought it's important to understand the change cycle, or where this actually came from was the grief cycle. And this model was developed by William Bridges, a professor from MIT, and it basically talks about the fact that when there's change, you have to end what you were doing, and then you have to begin something new. But then in the middle, there's where we just kind of float around. The stages that we go through are shock, denial, anger, frustration, ambivalence. And what's interesting is it's not necessarily linear. You could go right to ambivalence. Oh, this doesn't bother me. But then the more that because then you're right down in the neutral zone and you're just kind of mulling things over and not ready to move forward and whatnot. And all that ambivalence all of a sudden turns into anger. Or, I can't believe they're doing this. So what happens is shock, denial, anger, frustration, ambivalence can be a cycle that we rotate through, and it can be hodgepodge. We can bounce back and forth. We can jump from shock to anger, back to denial, back to ambivalence, and ultimately frustration, just driving us to the point where we can't function. But eventually, if the organization and leadership are doing the right things with messaging, guess who does the messaging? Public relations. We can start to bring the audience, publics, and members of the organization into a upward trajectory to where they're looking forward to the new state. Skepticism is usually the first step, because now even though they're skeptical, they're acknowledging that there's something up there in the future. Eventually acceptance, then hope that this is going to be really, really good. Then they begin to trust the solution, and finally they get enthusiastic. Again, this only happens if the leadership and the function of communication, which is the burden of public relations, both internally and externally, is done properly. We're able to move our I'm going to introduce to you a new word, stakeholders, through this cycle of change from endings to new beginnings. So take a look at this, and by the way, this applies to everything in life. This is not just with regard to the organization. Now, I want to come back, and rather than endings and new beginnings, I want to share with you what I said back in an earlier slide, that we help the organization move from where they were to where they want to be. We move from their current mission to where their ideal state is, which is their vision. Let's talk about mission for just a moment. Mission is why the organization exists today. For whom does it exist, and to what extent? The vision is where they want to be in the future. So in essence, we can say the ending is the old mission, and new beginnings is the new mission. Or if we're not performing at our current mission, what the mission statement says that we should be doing, it's our current state, and the new beginnings is when we're achieving the ideal mission state. So a couple ways to think about this change cycle. I threw the word stakeholders out there, and let's talk about that. The public encompasses our stakeholders. And who are potential stakeholders? They are people that have an equity interest in the company, otherwise known as stockholders. Now, by definition then, every stockholder is a stakeholder, but not every stakeholder is a stockholder, meaning that not every stakeholder is going to have an equity interest. They're going to get money somehow out of the company. Employees can be stockholders, and they are definitely stakeholders. The owner, common sense, stockholder and a stakeholder. Suppliers, probably not stockholders, but they could be. Related businesses, so businesses that we deal with in our supply chain, in our market, that we have to have relationships with. So in the broader sense, in your geographic area, let's say, you have an impact on any other business that's related to what you do. It can be either good or bad. I'll give you a great example. If you have, let's say you have a major retailer, Target, and Target announces that they're going out of business, there's a large portion of the public that will wonder if the economy is beginning to tank, and is this going to affect other businesses? Think about it in banking. This is what would happen with the crash back in 1929, and it was the start of the Great Depression. A bank had issues, and all of a sudden, people started visiting all their banks in order to safeguard their money, and so we ended up with a banking crisis. Think even more recently, the Colonial Pipeline was hacked and had to be shut down. Now, what's interesting is the Colonial Pipeline basically only affects the East Coast, and not all the East Coast. It kind of runs up along the Appalachian Mountain, and depending on where you are on the East Coast, it's going to have, actually it's not the mountains that it runs up along the Piedmont, geographic term, or geological term, I should say. And then there are some areas where it goes out to the coastal areas, but it's not necessarily the main source of petroleum for a large number of coastal towns. In Florida is where the pipeline begins, and it begins kind of close in the panhandle of Florida, in between Tallahassee and Jacksonville. And not Jacksonville, in between Tallahassee and Pensacola. I need to get my geography straight. And yet what's interesting is your major cities in Florida, Tampa, Jacksonville, Miami, those are coastal towns, and they all get their oil comes in via ship. Has nothing to do with the pipeline. There's a pipeline and truck routes that transport oil from Tampa to Orlando. So Orlando is serviced by the port of Tampa. I happened to be in North Carolina during the Colonial Pipeline crisis, and I was actually in a very isolated part of the Outer Banks, and we saw major gas lines. There were reports of people sitting in line for 3 and 4 hours, where because what was happening was the gas stations, even though they might have been multi-pump, and there was only one that I think of that had 2 pumps. The rest were all 4 or more. What were they doing? They were running 1 pump at a time, and creating a line. But more importantly, the news of the pipeline being shut down, and then stories of the gas lines, created panic in people. And people, whether they needed gas or not, went and filled their tanks up. Now, this happened to us midweek on our vacation. We had to get from North Carolina back to Florida. And I'll be very honest, I heard the news, and I panicked because I didn't know it's 2 tanks of gas, a tank and a half of gas to get from the Outer Banks in North Carolina back to Orlando. And I knew I was going to need every bit of gas possible. So I believe it was on the second day of the crisis, I got up early and went out to the gas station, and I was the next car in line to get to the pump. But by the time I had left, talk about timing, there were already 5 or 6 cars. I passed that pump later in the day. I passed that gas station later in the day, and the line was about 1.5 miles long to get in and get gas. So things that happen in one part of the industry can affect the entire industry. And, once we got off the island, we found we didn't have a problem at all. But yet there were reports all the way from Florida of lines in Orlando, lines in Tampa, lines in Jacksonville, and they had no issue with regard to the supply of petroleum because theirs were coming from ships. But they ended up having a problem because the demand increased greatly, people topping off their tanks. The normal economic flow of goods and services is based on a certain rhythm, and when something upsets that rhythm, something that upsets either the supply or upsets the demand, you have issues. So related businesses is critical. Nearby residents are affected, and as you can see, this list can be rather extensive. One of your jobs this week is to really think and be as specific as you can to outline everybody that has a stake in the organization. Now, what takes somebody from just being a public to being a stakeholder? Well, if something that the organization does can affect that individual or group, then they're a stakeholder. If that group or individual can do something that affects the company, they're also a stakeholder. So a stakeholder is a symbiotic relationship. It goes both from the company to the group and from the group back to the company. Let's talk about what happens within the organization. And this kind of goes back to what I was talking about in the first slide when we were talking about the organizational model. This gives you a little bit better picture. When change occurs from the external environment, there are transformational factors, and this can be the mission and strategy. It can affect the leadership of the organization, which is the organizational strategy, and it can affect the organizational culture, which comes back to the business strategy, but ultimately any of those items are going to affect the overall organization and create change. That change is going to create what I like to call transactional factors, or these are the operational or tactical items. So the structure, management practices, and systems and procedures, and ultimately the work climate. How does work get done? There's a great story about this, and I think as a master's student you should know it. It is there was a Western Electric plant in the Midwest somewhere, and they were doing a study of work conditions. And what they decided to do was to see if they increased the lighting in the plant where people were putting together telephones, if that would have an impact on productivity. So the industrial engineers that were putting this study together, they went in and they changed the lighting. And guess what happened? Productivity went up. They said, well, I wonder if we change the workstations and create a more ergonomic, I don't think they used that term back then, but a more ergonomic workstation, is that going to have an impact on productivity? They went in and they made the changes, and sure enough, productivity went up again. And they started to analyze this data, and they were like, okay, so we've made these changes. what happens if we reduce the lighting? Maybe we're spending too much on electricity and lighting in the plant, and what happens if we reduce the lighting? Is there a place where we can still have increased productivity but not spend as much? So they decreased the lighting, and guess what happened? Productivity went up again. The lessons from the Western Electric experiments was this: that when you pay attention to people, regardless of the change that you're making, when you pay attention to people usually respond in a very positive manner. So just a little bit of master's training. If you were doing an MBA, for example, this would be a case study that you'd study in your org management class. All right, and then finally, how does this impact the individual? Well, it may change the task or the skills that are needed. It may affect a person's motivation. It may impact their individual needs and values, and ultimately that can affect performance. So that's why the role of public relations as a boundary organization, from the CEO, from the C-suite to the general organization, and then to the publics at large, that's how all this works. All right. And that, by the way, is the Burke-Litwin model. You can look it up and learn more about it if you're so inclined. So what creates change? Well, there's a lot of different drivers. There's people. You change the CEO in a company and you're going to create change, absolutely, because they're going to have a new take on what the mission and vision should be. So whenever there's a C-suite change, there's change. Information and communication technology, the tools that we use to do work, can impact change. I remember back at Disney, I was part of the change team for implementing SAP, which is an enterprise resource planning platform that encompasses human resources and finance. And the changes in that were huge. And so we had to deal with the change from the change in technology. And then there's globalization. Whether you're a globalist or a non-globalist, there are things that happen with regard to the competitiveness of the global market alone that will impact what happens to the organization. So size and competitiveness of the market. And finally, from a cultural standpoint, what is the worldview? So in my discussion lectures this week, one of the things that I ask you to do is to take a look at postmodernism, because postmodernism is really the worldview that drives so much of the culture that we see in the media, both in legacy media and in new media. So in essence, the drivers of change are worldview, geopolitics, demographics, economic, social, cultural norms, political, regulatory issues, the technological things that are occurring naturally, and competitive items. That's why I ask you to do both a PESTLE analysis and a SWOT analysis, because we want to understand where the drivers of change are coming from. So something as you're getting a digital marketing degree. You're a technologist, whether you realize it or not. And one of the things that you should know is Moore's Law. Moore's Law drives technological change. Who was Moore? Moore was the CEO of Intel way back. And he had, 40, 50 years ago, he created this maxim that has held true today, even though many times over the years, people thought that we had reached a limit, and somebody would probably get out there on the podium and proclaim, Moore's Law is dead. Well, I'm here to tell you, Moore's Law continues to live. What is Moore's Law? Moore's Law says that approximately every 2 years, it's like 18 months to 24 months, it's a general time frame, that the power of the chip, the computing power, will double. But the cost for that increased power will decrease by 50 cents, by 50 cents, by 50%. And so every 18 to 24 months, you see that cycle happening. I got news. It's actually been advancing, and there's been various businesses that have led to that increase. Intel being one of them, and their big partners, which would be Apple or more so Apple than anybody else. Apple really worked in partnership with Intel to get a blueprint or a roadmap of chip development that goes 2050 or so, I think, is the last part of the roadmap that I saw. So what does that mean? It means that computer technology and computer processing changes. Now, okay, so we talked about the chip from Intel and we talked about Apple. And you may be saying, well, those are just two companies. How does this impact everything? Think of everything that has a chip in it today. Every appliance, every tool that you use, every automobile. Think of the computers that are in automobiles today. You need a computer technologist to diagnose and work on your car, unless you're driving a 1970s Yugo. So and that's what we look at in terms of cost. So as a consumer, we're expecting every 18 months or so, and I'm going to go quicker because think of how often Apple puts an iPhone out. All right, so they've actually been able to work quicker. What do we expect? We expect a tremendous amount of increase in functionality for the same or less price for what we paid for the last version. So when I got my iPhone 12, it had a better camera, it had better processing, it was faster, it had a whole lot of new technology incorporated into it, and it was about the same price that I paid for my iPhone 11. So that's what we expect. When products and services do not follow Moore's Law, it creates a ripple in the marketplace. But you need to understand what Moore's Law is and how Moore's Law works on the general economy in order to truly understand change. So let's talk about the ways that we're changing. Current trends, we can look at the increase in interpersonal connections. Self-organization is another area. The efficacy of an aging population. I mean, I remember buying a first generation TI 99.4A personal computer for my dad, because my dad was a technology guy. We had the first color TV on our block because Dad built it in the garage. We were the first house on the block to have an airplane built in the car garage and wheeled out the driveway and put on a trailer and taken down the street to the airport. That was the house that I grew up in. But when and that was when my dad was in his prime. As my dad began aging, I wanted to keep him relevant, and I wanted to teach him computers, and I bought him a TI 99.4A. I'm sorry, I wasn't living at home then, and I'm sorry to say that the number of times that computer came out of the box were the times that I came to visit. I am the age that my dad was when I gave him that first computer. And so as an aging population, I hate to say that, I think I'm still, in my 20s. My wife would probably vehemently disagree, but up here anyway. So, we're able to continue to be highly effective and highly involved in society much, much longer. My mom died when she was 57. So, the efficacy of an aging population is a huge change in society, and it has implication to businesses. What are some of the developing trends? Well, AI is huge, and there's a drive. This one bothers me significantly. A drive from individualism to collectivism. And this is kind of interesting, and I'll use the cell phone as an example. When I grew up, we had a phone in the house, and so everybody in the house, my brother, my sister, my mother and father, when somebody would ask if what our phone number was, it was easy. It was 215-639-1395. That was the phone number I grew up with. And when the phone rang, we would all run to go answer the phone because could be for one of us. And the phone was in the kitchen. Now that phone, it had a cord that would stretch around the dining room out into the living room. It was massive. It was one of those springy cords. We had that for a very long time, and then it was kind of interesting because this technology developed. I told you my dad was pretty handy. He decided to wire the house for other phone extensions. We did it ourselves. The phone company didn't do it. And I was so excited when I had my own extension in the house. And you've probably seen the movies where somebody picks up the phone and then somebody else picks up another phone and listens in the house. Well, that was the norm in the 60s and 70s. So we went from collectivism to individualism. Cell phones took that a step further. Everybody in the family, when cell phones became cheap enough, I had one of the original bag phones for when I traveled. So it was in a bag about yay big and plug into my car. But when we got into cell phones, the flip phone and the smaller cell phone, and they became reasonably priced, I wanted to make sure my kids had one. I wanted to stay in touch with my kids. So all my kids got a phone because the price came down and they were available. Well, what did that mean? That meant that eventually the family phone and the family phone number became obsolete. And after a point in time, we no longer had a family, what did everybody call it, a landline. Everybody had cell phones. And everybody had their own ringtone. The amount of individualism was huge. Question: is technology now being used to drive collectivism and to have us group together? One example you might say is, how is technology being used in terms of collectivism with regard to the pandemic? So there are a number of developing trends that we need to constantly be taking a look at, and I think these are two good lists to start with. So I'm not going to go into each of these. You can do a screenshot and take these and work with them down the road. Okay, so for this assignment in week 1, you're going to need some external tools. And guess what? We don't provide you those tools. We tell you that, give you a couple examples, and you need to go out and find them. And then you're going to have to find the way to use them. There's plenty of YouTube videos on how to for just about everything that's out there. And they're important to learn because and to learn how to use the free versions, which usually have a limited number of access. I'll give you an example that I don't have on here. I'm trying to think which one. The Hoth. The Hoth is an SEO tool, and I believe, I'll give you even a better one. Neil Patel. Neil Patel has a tool, and he only gives you 10 clicks a day on the tool. And a click is not necessarily what you think. Every time you move your mouse in Neil Patel's tool, you're using a click. Now, I have a number of business partners and clients that use Neil Patel on a daily basis, and their company doesn't pay for the software. They use the free version, but they found that the free version, even with its limitations, is so valuable that they use it. Now, I guess if I were independently wealthy, I'd go ahead and buy subscriptions to all these. I don't. I buy subscriptions when I'm working with a client, and I pass the cost on to the client if we need a particular tool. Now, some that I have on here, like TweetDeck and Google Alerts, there's no cost to use those, and you can use the whole system. Those are very good. But others like Feedly, NetVibes, for social media, Hootsuite, Sprout Social, Social Mention, you need to learn how to maximize the free version of these, unless you're willing to go out and pay, or your company is willing to go out and pay, or you've got a client that's willing to go out and pay. And with I love the Neil Patel example, because my client, it's kind of funny. He has about 5 different email addresses. So instead of the 10 clicks per day, he has a reserve or a total of 50 clicks per day, because he'll log back in under a different email and then refresh the 10 clicks with that email. So he's found that about 50 clicks a day is more than enough to cover what he needs Neil Patel for, and he doesn't have to buy a full subscription. Now, what's interesting is most of these software companies, if you sign up and join them, they will send you emails, and a lot of the emails are how-to techniques for different activities, and they really show you the most succinct and precise way to click through their platform to get what you need. So they almost tell you how to use it effectively for the free version. So take a look at these tools. Understand that there's more tools that pop up every day. A lot of times when they're new, the features will be that they let you use for free will be bountiful. But then as their user base grows with paid subscriptions, right, the whole purpose for free is try it, and if you decide you like it, use it. When they get to a certain critical mass, they start to really shut down on the extent of the free tools that are available. But that's digital marketing, and that's the freemium business model. So just to be aware. And you always want to stay relevant. I should add one more thing. You always want to stay relevant on these tools. So I'm always looking for new tools, because I always want to provide my client the option of the best tool possible. If I'm trying to put a screw into a board, I don't want to use a hammer. I want to use a screwdriver, and ideally I want to use a power screwdriver. Okay. Let's talk about monitoring. What do I want you to report on that you've learned from the week 1 assignment? Well, you got to get your monitoring system up and running. And once you do that, what you then want to do is to look for items that are you want to curate items that you can repurpose and share. Why are you looking for curatable content? You're looking for curatable content because it's so much easier to repurpose and send it out than it is to create it from scratch. Why is this important? Well, that brand awareness component of the function of public relations. To build a relationship with your audiences, you've got to communicate. How much do you need to communicate? A lot. I'll tell you a story back when I used to run political campaigns. I used to do no official party campaigns, meaning that I was running judicial candidates that wanted to be either a circuit judge in the state of Florida or a county judge in the state of Florida. Now, because of judicial ethics, there's only certain things that we can talk about. I can't talk about their position on past cases, can't talk about their position on cases that might come up before the court, but we can talk about their background, their upbringing, their family. Essentially, what we're doing is building name recognition. And as I used to tell my judicial clients, the campaign season effectively runs from middle to end of October to Election Day, the first week in November. And during that period, we need to hit the voting public, registered voters, with at least 12 pieces of direct mail. This was before digital Web 2.0 was around. We need to hit their mailboxes with about 12 pieces of direct mail. Think that's not expensive? Well, it's nothing compared to what if they want to win. I would then tell the candidates that if you want to really be in the game and have a very good chance of winning, you're going to need to send between 24 and 36 pieces of direct mail during that time frame. Now, I had a whole plan. Every mailing had a very specific theme, and I could lay that out for the candidate. So much like an editorial calendar, here was my editorial plan for what the direct mail pieces would look like. Of course, each of them would be customized for the particular candidate that I was working with. But 24 to 36, and I would throw the caveat on. If we are not out mailing your competitor, then it becomes a coin toss, much like playing at a casino where the house has 51%. So if the competitor outspends us, even though we may be at the high range of 36 pieces, if they've sent out 37, 38, 40 pieces, the odds of winning now swing to the competitor, and it may be 51, 52, 53%, but they have a little bit better chance of winning. That's a lot of content to produce. In the digital realm, it's much easier because we can curate content, we can repurpose it and share it. So probably for this part of the assignment, finding 2 pieces of content that you can reshare and repurpose is probably the easiest part of what did you take away from this assignment. But be specific as to what those 2 pieces are. Also, if you identify a potential crisis. Now, in normal times, this might be a challenge, but we're living in non-normal times. I don't know if anybody's told you that. But cripes, when you got a fortress built around the United States Capitol, and Washington, D.C. looks like a third world country's capital city, we're not living in normal times. Regardless of the reasons, I'm just saying we're not living in normal times. And a lot of that was caused by what? It was caused by the pandemic, COVID. So anything related to COVID could be a potential crisis. So that's another easy one. The last thing that we're looking for are pseudo newsworthy events. We're looking for ideas that other brands have used to create a newsworthy item, and we want to take that item and use the seed of it, the basic idea, but totally reshape it and use it then to put out our own pseudo newsworthy event. Now, a newsworthy event is something that the media, whether it's legacy or new media, those individuals, those journalists, will be willing to tell their audience about. So and we'll get more into newsworthy events, both real and pseudo, in week 2. So that's what we're monitoring for in week 1. And lastly, I want to introduce you to your week 4 assignment, which is a crisis communication plan, which is where you're going to take everything that you learned in weeks 1, 2, and 3, reshape it, and put it back into a plan to deal with a crisis that another company, as we talked about, a case study company that's not necessarily the case study company that you're bringing along for the entire degree program, but another case study company and your crisis communication plan for them. So the elements of that plan are to identify the issue or problem, what are the risks, what's the mitigation strategy, to establish a crisis response team, to identify key stakeholders. That's important because your messaging needs to go back to the key stakeholders, who the spokesperson is, establish the proper communication methods, develop specific responses. Again, this goes back to the stakeholders. Are your messages ubiquitous to all stakeholders, or do they need to be tailored to different stakeholder groups? And ultimately to think of this in terms of new media. All right. Couple terms: strategic context, the situatedness of an organization, of an organizational entity. In other words, what is their strategy? What is their business environment? What are all the elements that can create change as it relates to that organization? That's the strategic context. Mission, I already talked about this, why the organization exists today, for whom and to what extent. Critical success factors, large project requiring capital, finance, human capital, or other critical resource that is directed at achieving the mission or vision of the organization. And strategy is just another word for the activities that move us from point A to point B, otherwise known as a critical success factor. And that, folks, is the end of this lecture. So I hope this has provided you a good understanding of all the factors that go into week one, because week one is all the factors that go into effectively running a proper public relations function on the strategic internet. Okay? So take care, and if you got any questions, don't hesitate to reach out.